Oh, today on the show we have Anthony DeOrsey. Anthony is a research manager at CleanTech Group, and we met because I read their annual report at the end of last year, probably 1,000 times. There were a bunch of people that released end of year reports, aggregations of research, things like this, and theirs was by far my personal favorite. So I'd recommend reading it yourself, letting me know what you think. But I reached out to one of the researchers, and she agreed to podcast and introduced me to the rest of her team. So this is the first episode in a series of episodes where we are deconstructing their annual report, and I am so excited. This was Anthony is the research manager, so this was a more overall overarching view on the topic, but just so educational. I mean, I'm just so glad that I was able to ask some of the questions that I did, because they're things I wonder myself. And Anthony is, his life is to research these questions. So it was very informative, very awesome. The way that he chose to answer them. I'm very excited for you to listen. Shout out as always to our sponsors, CleanTech Growth Lab. If you're looking to grow in clean tech, they're the people to work with, and the producers of this podcast, Craze and Friends. I love working with them, and you would too. But without them, this would not be possible. So now, I give you Anthony. Oh, welcome to another episode of The Grow. Thank you to the sponsors. Shouted out just before we pressed record, but without them, it would not be possible to interview awesome people doing awesome things like Anthony. Welcome.
Great to be here, Blake. Appreciate the invite.
Absolutely. I could not help myself. I gave you a lot of excitement at the beginning of this call, but I could not hold my excitement back when I read your report released at the end of last year, 2026 annual report about what's happening in clean tech. And this is a very special, this is the beginning of a very special series of episodes that we have breaking down that report. So I think it's only fitting that this is the first one. We got a lot to cover. I think your perspective on what's been happening in clean tech, how to build it, stuff like that is super awesome. For anyone that doesn't know yet, if you give a brief introduction of yourself and what you're building.
Yeah, great. So my name is Anthony DeOrsey. I'm the research manager at CleanTech Group. If anybody's not familiar with CleanTech Group, we call ourselves the Human Intelligence Authority on clean tech innovation. And if I were to pick that apart in a few ways, we do really pride ourselves on being human intelligence. And my team, our market intelligence team, we spend our time going out and doing this, just with founders, corporates, investors, people who are hands-on in the field with the technology to understand from the bottom up what is broken in the system and how new technology can fix it. And from there, we form perspectives and we render those in a few different ways. We have a market intelligence platform and service that we have all kinds of members from corporates, investors, governments, economic development agencies who engage. And we do a series of events every year too. The Clean Tech Forums. Just had our biggest one of the year in California, the Clean Tech Forum North America. We do one in Europe every year in a different city, and in Singapore as well. So what we really try to do is consistently develop intelligence off of human intelligence and bring that to a member base that, again, is in a pool of clients, but also is in the form of event attendees, and try to keep them updated on the newest things that we think are going to impact the markets.
So, just so many questions about so many different directions that we could go as far as, because it's very broad, I think what you guys report on, what clean tech means. But before we get there, did you, as a child, run around saying, I cannot wait to be this clean tech, research manager at CleanTech Group, or did something happen at some point?
No, no to the first question. It was certainly not my ambition. I think, my ambitions evolved as a child from wanting to play safety for the New England Patriots. That didn't quite work out. That became apparent probably probably pretty early that wasn't going to happen.
Yeah.
And then, oddly enough, and I'll share it because it's just that kind of venue here. My idol growing up was Stuart Scott, the ESPN
Nice.
sportscaster.
Oh yeah.
I used to get up every day at 6 to watch SportsCenter just to hear Stuart's spiel because he could cover so many things so fast, but was so intelligent with his delivery. So that is not to say I made a direct connection between being a sportscaster for ESPN and doing what I do today, but that was probably the first indication that I was going to really like going deep in research and then talking to people enthusiastic about those things. To answer your question in a more serious way, my arc a little bit was post-college. I had thought that I was going to go to law school. I thought better of it. No shade to lawyers, but I did a little bit of time in a startup and felt like this is just the best way to spend a workday, is to work in fast-paced environments, working on things that are really important. A really important detail is that startup was in China. I had moved to China after college to do a year stint as an English teacher, left that halfway through to join this startup. And that was in 2011. And I felt like there's no more interesting place in the world to be than China in the next few years. And you really saw this very nuanced thing happening in China where the economic growth was so significant and people's lives were getting measurably better every year. But there was this huge environmental impact, right, of the progress and of that much growth in the economy, and especially in the real economy of manufacturing. That really put into perspective for me that it is not a black and white. You should not be dropping economic growth in these improvements that come to people's lives for something like environmental impact reduction, but you also shouldn't be ignoring that because that's going to create real life implications. And that to me felt like the biggest opportunity and most exciting thing you could really do in the world. It's how you just do growth better. So that was probably my first foray into sustainability. And that was the startup I worked in. It was one that made natural cleaning products from sustainable sources. It was kind of a wild ride, but it was a lot of fun. Went from there to working in a market entry consulting firm in China. And then, a few jobs later, ended up here at CleanTech Group. But always was that through line of how do you use technology to make people's lives better, but also to create a bit of shared growth and prosperity. So I'll cut it there, but it's been a little bit of a winding journey more than an arc. But these ideas have always excited me. So really count myself lucky to be able to be immersed in them every day.
So first thing is if that's an idol, does that make CleanTech Group the sports center of CleanTech?
Absolutely is the sports center of CleanTech. And I think
right.
you reached out after the publishing of our global CleanTech 100, which everybody refers to as the Super Bowl of CleanTech.
Oh, nice.
Happens the first month of the year. Everybody I'm defining probably is just myself. But yeah, we see ourselves as being at the center of many nodes in this space, right? We have members to our market intelligence service who are the corporates, the investors, the governments. Innovators are an indispensable part of our network. We work with them in a few ways, obviously as a source of information when we're doing our research, but also we're a mechanism by which their perspectives get represented in front of their potential corporate adopters and investors. And then we do things like the Global CleanTech 100 and our forums to really give these innovators a stage to be telling that story in a really impactful way. So yeah, we're the sports center. NFL, and Nike, I guess you could say, CleanTech all at the same time.
No, I love it. I'm curious. Also, with the introduction to the space being in China, and with China being what they are, as far as where they stand with clean tech and what they represent, and all of the, in whatever industry you want to pick, I feel like in clean tech, there's always something to say about what China is doing or has done. Was there something? I'm talking about the cultural approach to clean tech and what it is. Did you see that there was a difference to how people received or thought about or built clean tech in China versus here, when you were living there and then once you moved here?
Yeah, I think the answer to that question is, there's a book that everybody's reading of late called Breakneck by Dan Long, and it captures really well the differences in culture around economic development in China and the US. And he has this way of characterizing it, calling China the engineering society and the U.S. the lawyerly society. That is a good high-level characterization, but I think something that I really observed being there is you get policy signals, and those usually have some type of translation into economic outcomes. Here's an industry the government wants to see develop. Here are markets that are going to be opened to people who are developing in these industries. And you get a very heavy crowding in effect. What that does, in my opinion, is that really creates this kind of petri dish of competition. And yes, you may have some people who are ignoring other industries to pursue this industry that's getting a signal. But whereas I think a lot of people kind of understand it as China really subsidizing or government supporting some of the clean tech, that's a part of it. But there's just so much competition, and there's a really high tolerance for failure in China, in the sense that I think it is accepted across the economy and likely in the government to an extent. A bunch of companies are going to get born, a bunch are going to compete, and most are just going to die. There's not going to be a guaranteed outcome for these. And I don't remember the exact stat. I don't want to give you a wrong one, but sure. Back when it was signaled that electric vehicles were going to be a priority, I'm going back 15 years ago, sure. It snowballed to a point where it went from being a few dozen electric vehicle companies up to in the hundreds. And now I don't know exactly how many there are in China, but most have died off. And I was there last spring talking to somebody in an EV OEM who is one of the big names in China. And he essentially, the sense I got from the conversation was he's taking nothing for granted. And that company is not even certain that they're going to be standing in a few years, simply because of the intensity of their own competition within China, right? His perspective was there's 3 or 4 very strong EV companies in China, and we're not all going to win. So in that regard, I think there's a lot more tolerance for the idea that there are going to be a wave of failures before there's a success case. But then what you're seeing in the EV space in China, what you saw in solar too, is although that pool may thin drastically, a few global winners get born out of it.
So are you saying that a lot of, at least as far as clean tech goes, the innovation that happens there and the markets and companies that develop are strongly the first domino in that chain is a policy signal, you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm going to put kind of a crude characterization on things, it's there was always kind of this joke when I lived in China that in the U.S., everything is legal until somebody tells you it's illegal. And in China, you can assume it's illegal till somebody tells you it's legal. Okay. And I think that's, the policy signals really help with that. And you can look at this across different industries. This was the case in e-commerce in China 15 years ago, is where there's more liberalization of things like mobile payments, et cetera. More people crowded into the space. So I would kind of give your question a soft yes. The policy signals matter. It is not everything, though. And I do think it's an error in analysis we risk making on this side of the Pacific, that it's just all held up by subsidies. And if you remove those subsidies or incentives, that's all going to collapse. That might be the case in the early stages of an industry development in China, but I would really drive home that there's such intense competition often that those who are left standing are just well beyond really needing much support.
Is there something that, again, we're speaking broadly, but is there something that the U.S. could learn from China as far as trying to cultivate markets or industries, or at least just technologies that are better suited for longer term sustainability?
I think understanding certain government support at the beginning of an industry as being an investment, and not necessarily expecting every single company to thrive, expecting to support industries up to a level and then see those splinter off into networks of suppliers and seeing knowledge disseminate through the economy. I think that would be a better approach, because you see long-term effects of that. You can draw maybe a bit of a squiggly line, but you can draw a line from things like national labs, university research that might get government grants, out to launch of technologies, and then perhaps in some cases tax incentives, subsidies to get it moving. And then beyond that, you let competition take hold. I do think we have a risk in this country of assessing these things a year, 2 years, sometimes barely a year in, and saying, well, there's no outcomes, it's a failure. And viewing things as purely through a cost lens of this cost X amount of taxpayer dollars. If you look at some of the industries that we've fallen behind in, electric vehicles is definitely one, batteries is one, solar is another. We can go down the list. This wasn't all because of just outsourcing or trade. That's a component of it. But I think a big part of it is there was controversy on these for a long time. Of government backing, subsidies was seen as very controversial, and there was a need for, or a desire rather, for immediate outcomes. I think understanding the trajectory of technology and that these dividends probably don't become apparent for a decade plus beyond, that would be a better mindset to adopt. That said, some of the things we have in our favor are a great entrepreneurial environment once you get out of a lab setting, right? I tend to very much so fall on the side that, yes, government grants are a big part of developing technology, but, and this is author's own opinion, the hard 90% is taking that out and scaling it. And the 99, you could say 100% of the risk is on the entrepreneur who's going to put themselves at personal financial risk to go out and grow this technology. And there's not many places in the world that you can do that as well as you can do it in the U.S. There's a robust capital ecosystem. There is a good comprehensive set of laws to protect IP, and you've got a good talent pool. So there's advantages here too. I think it's more about taking those advantages from strength to strength and allowing that beginning stage of technological development to cross the gap into commercialization a little bit better. And again, that's a broad generalization,
right?
Much of it my own opinion, but there are a few things that can be learned there.
Cool. Okay. So I actually, because there's a couple more things that I'm just going to write them down and save them for later, because the first, that I appreciate you indulging my curiosity, because that was a lot of that was just based on what you said. The one thing I wanted to make sure that we got to was something that you spoke about in your report. That I think does tie to our discussion about macro level, how to create an industry, how industries evolve, the different components societally that give rise to entrepreneurship, these types of things. Can you help us? Can you help position us in clean tech history? So what is clean tech history, and how do we understand our place in it now in order to then talk about its significance?
Yeah, and I think that's a great perspective to take, Blake. When you're reading a lot of the media reports around this theme, we consider it a theme at CleanTech Group, not an industry, because it's comprised of many different tech areas. And we paint very broadly from agriculture, energy, materials and chemicals, transport, waste, natural resources. If you're looking at this theme in its totality, it's very common to take venture capital investments as a proxy for confidence in the technology. Sure. You'll hear a lot of reports of a big drop-off since 2021 and 2022. But a few things were happening then. There was essentially zero interest rates. It was really low. It was a low interest rate environment. Risk was very much so encouraged. There were these net zero signals around the world. And frankly, I think you had a lot of people pivot into the space who were chasing trends. And you probably had some companies get funded or overfunded in that period that just were funded beyond what they could, they got valuations beyond what they could support in eventual revenue growth. So then you saw down rounds, you saw a bit of value destruction. That's the narrative of recent years. That ends up getting over-indexed on, in my opinion, because those 2 years, 2021 and 2022, were really an aberration because of what was happening in the global macro economy with COVID. If you zoom out, even just 10 years, use those same venture capital investments as a proxy, an entire year of investments, 2025, 2026, would only equal what you're seeing in a quarter in 2025. So that is fundamentally a 4x in 10 years. Again, take 2021, 2022 out of the equation. That is a strong upward trend. It was ticking up incrementally from 2015 up until 2019. We're still up from 2019. So that's how I would encourage people to think about it is if you're just using that indicator, it's a good one, and it's probably the most easily accessible one because everybody understands it, that is really still growing. So that's one point I would bring to everybody in terms of where we're at in clean tech history. I'd also really encourage people to look at the deployment end of the spectrum too. The technologies that are beyond innovation, that are much more commoditized out in mass deployment. And you're seeing more renewable energy and batteries especially get deployed than ever nowadays. So I won't risk misquoting the IEA or some of the true authorities on deployment, but those numbers are higher than they've ever been. And I'd also point at the performance of things like the clean energy ETF in public markets, which has outperformed the NASDAQ and even the S&P in recent times. So, at that later stage when things have been proven, they've had the benefit of learning effects from years of manufacturing. They've got robust supply chains. They're easily understood technologies to the adopters. Things are behaving differently, and there's less volatility than you might imagine. Again, there's been big disruptions in the past year from things like the effective repeal of the Inflation Reduction Act, uncertainty on tax credits, and that is going to have a blunting effect on deployment, at least on that trajectory we were on in 2024, and then blunted a little bit last year.
Well, there are some opinions that say that the stripping of all that regulation and the subsidies and things are from some perspective a good thing, because it's helping companies build on top of stronger capitalistic fundamentals, I guess, where they have to worry about being a strong fundamental company outside of the fact that they're clean tech or green tech or sustainable or something like that. Is that anything that you guys see or believe or is true?
I think it's true. I'm going to be a little bit blunt here. I think the people really trumpeting that as a new revelation or maybe a little bit late to the party, there were things that were hitting an economic wall prior to the removal of those tax credits. And I think those were some of the things that were perhaps being overinvested on and oversupplied in the innovation ecosystem on the altruistic argument. So I have a few things here, and this is not at all an indictment of the folks developing these technologies. I think these are worthy pursuits, but things like carbon removals, carbon management, right? Absolutely a worthy pursuit. You had a lot of technologies that were not market ready. You had a largely voluntary carbon market, and there was a lot of faith that got shaken back in, I think, 2023, 2024, around that time. There were some scandals there. That really had a negative demand effect on these technologies. And if you're looking at who's purchasing the offsets, it's primarily tech companies who are offsetting the rise in their emissions from data centers. At the end of the day, it's a very small buyer pool for a large pool of suppliers. That was well in motion prior to 2025. I look at another area, and that's hydrogen. Got a lot of good signals from the outset of the Inflation Reduction Act. There's a lot of enthusiasm out there about the new markets for hydrogen, new being things like bringing hydrogen into steel for direct reduction of iron, bringing hydrogen into distance transport, fuel cells for trucks, backup power, seasonal shifting, whereas it had previously been used primarily for ammonia production, and then ammonia is primarily going, or the bigger markets are going to be in fertilizer. What had happened there is that you basically saw people run into challenges with the economics. Producing green hydrogen, even with the tax credits, it was still finding challenges in working its way into these new growth markets, these markets where it hadn't been adopted before. That was already hitting challenges in 2024. You also had a series of project cancellations in that space. I'm thinking primarily in the steel application. So again, there was this, you had these economic realities get hit that were sending signals back through the value chain that this might not be the best area to innovate in. That was happening prior to the change in the tax credits, and the tax credits really just got phased out a little bit faster for hydrogen. It was not a fundamental removal. So, I mean, that's one part of the answer to your question, is that I think there were some things that already were on the downturn prior to removal of tax credits. The argument of some things now needing to perform on their market fundamentals, Yeah, I would say that's the case in spaces like industrial decarbonization, things like cement, steel, electrification of heat. That's all got to be delivered at a lower cost than fossil heat right now to compete. That said, many of these technologies were very early. And in that regard, I do think what we risk doing is pushing out the date by which they can become cost competitive.
Okay.
So removal of grants or shuttering of some of the departments issuing grants, removal of tax credits. I don't think it kills what would have been zombie industries, so to speak. What I think it does is it frankly takes some areas that were wide open for global competition, and it just makes it a little bit harder to compete in the U.S. in those. Nonetheless, some folks are still doing it, and I think that's very much so to their credit. So I don't think I don't think the statement that now companies are competing on stronger market fundamentals is untrue, but I do think it's a limited perspective. I do think there were some things getting pushed to market fundamentals already.
Right. So in some, it was that was in motion already, and the new administration cutting all these things accelerated it, or maybe just brought it into public focus. Would that be?
I think you've got two classes of things that were facing headwinds to begin with, and then where the tax credits probably wouldn't have made much of a difference, and then some things that were still years out in terms of economic competitiveness, and now you've just kind of pushed them further out.
Understood. Okay, got it. Something small, curious. The proxy of VC investment. I believe this, if I understand correctly. So one of the proxies that you use to define clean tech history is VC investment, and the other one is deployment.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. What is? Are there any misconceptions about using those things as proxies, or limiters of using those things as proxies, and what else can be used as a proxy, if anything, to define clean tech and to understand its history?
Yeah, I think when you're defining progress, you've got a few things. I think you're looking forward, right? So that's where VC investments are very helpful, because it's telling you about confidence in the future potential. Again, these returns from the investments haven't been actualized yet. So that's always a good barometer of confidence in future potential. If you're looking at things like deployment, that's a very good barometer for where the market is at today in terms of readiness to absorb technology. I think in the middle, you've got a few other things that are now actually quite well tracked, and that's going to be offtake agreements. So say you're setting up a pilot plant of something like a new type of battery. It's going to be very capital intensive. You probably you haven't exited or sold the company yet, so you don't have a return on those investments for your investors yet. But you've got committed off-takers, might be an automotive OEM, might be another battery company, agreeing to purchase your batteries when they come off the line. That is, I think, today becoming a very good barometer of that middle period, things where you'd have trouble measuring in terms of deployment or products in the field, but it's kind of starting to tell you where the needle is moving from initial investment out to realization of revenue.
Got it. So last thing on this point, which 30 minutes in, we're on the the first pillar, which is hilarious. This is really fascinating to me, and I really appreciate how we've navigated this so far. But one other, I guess, narrative that I have consumed and that I think is cool, but I'm curious if this is what you guys also see, is that when we talk about clean tech history, depending on who you'll read, there's like we're in phase 2 or phase 3 or something like that. But overall, what I've read is that somewhere in between, let's say maybe 2005, 2010 to like COVID-ish, there was a huge, like the 2010s, I'd say, there's a huge deployment of hardware and a lot of investment in physical products and companies deploying things that could capture data in a high quality way. I guess broadly speaking. And then once a bunch of that infrastructure was laid in a bunch of different areas, whatever the application was in whatever industry, once that infrastructure was there, the hardware infrastructure, then there was the capability for software companies to come in and say, what are we going to do with this data? What particular use cases can we use this for? And how can we actually take this data that we're measuring in crazy amounts and make it usable, not only for potential compliance or make regulation more effective, but to help companies make better decisions. And so then, I guess, again, loosely speaking, since 2020 or so, then it's like phase 2 of clean tech is all of these software companies and data clarification, whatever companies. Is that, I guess, a theme that you guys see? Would you talk about it differently? Is it even useful?
No, I think it's a useful general construct. You'll hear the term a lot, CleanTech 1.0, referring to in the early aughts, things like when solar, batteries, biofuels, wind were first coming into the market, and really were kind of, in many ways, new innovations at the time. We don't use that terminology of CleanTech 1.0 and 2.0, and the reason is we consider cleantech to be a theme, not an industry. And we also see this as just being a continuous evolution. Energy transition, mobility transition into cleaner chemicals, these are multi-decade journeys. And that's where I think it is super important, as we had covered at the top, to just not over-index on 1 year or 1 quarter. It's important to understand that, but putting it into the broader context of where things have been, where they're likely to go, is ultimately what's going to facilitate better decisions. And, I think something that's certainly changed my mindset on that is accumulation of years of talking to corporates who think in many cases in decades, whereas investors have a different mandate. They need to think in years. And if you're trading on the public markets, people are thinking quarters, maybe weeks, right? So I think having that diversity of opinion and perspective helps shape the thinking. To answer your question more directly, I think you had that early wave of clean tech, which was solar, wind, biofuels, batteries, and that had its bubble and burst. When I was coming into this space in 2019, there was kind of this reawakening after the so-called clean web of things like virtual power plants, distributed energy management, software for managing rooftop solar and prospecting. I came into CleanTech Group really at the tail end of that, and then got in at the time when there was a renewed enthusiasm around hardware. And that was happening across the board, which was a really interesting time if I think back to just pre-COVID, because you had folks saying, all right, well, we've got a good track on the renewable energy. That's still not continuous, clean, firm baseload power. Let's start to re-explore that. And that's where you saw things like enhanced geothermal come back into the frame. Something we just covered quite a bit in our CleanTech Forum North America last week was, look, 6-7 years ago when we would raise nuclear fission, you had a mix of disbelief and indignation from our clients that some would say, well, that's not pure clean tech. This should be renewables and only renewables. And other people would have been jaded from the years of inactivity and then some cost overruns in the U.S. on deployment of fission who said, well, it's just not going to work, right? But you started to see more innovators come into that space. Now you're seeing that in full force. Fission, fusion, geothermal, right? And that started to really percolate back in, I'd say, 2019, 2020. You also had this other thing happening, which was people looking outside of energy and looking quite wide. I think one of my first projects at CleanTech Group was on battery recycling. And that was my first exposure really to just how complex the materials supply chain is, how sensitive it is, and how easily disrupted it could be. And now that is, you open the Wall Street Journal any day and critical minerals it's on the front page every day, right? So that shift started a few years ago. And that's where I would say that's the phase we are still in. We've had a little bit of an ebb and flow where other things got crowded in, things like hydrogen, things like carbon capture. There was a little bit of an agricultural, agricultural crop inputs and fertilizers renaissance in there too, electric mobility. You've had some ebb and flows, but I do think this shift that kind of started around 2019, 2020 of saying, well, what's the next wave of clean power going to be? And it's got to be this clean, firm base load, but there's multiple flavors to it. That started then. And also this thought process around, all right, in a more electrified economy, electric vehicles, more consumer electronics, batteries is a viable medium of backup storage. We just need way more materials, and we're just not stable on the supply chains. That all started a few years ago. So I still think we're on a continual arc from that period.
Got it.
Let me pause there before I get too carried away with it.
No, good. Well, just because the opportunity presented itself, I'm going to jump ahead in my little scribbled itinerary here, and I'm gonna say, how do we understand? I mean, you started to explain it, in a way that makes total sense about the story of critical materials, the story of critical resources. You said it's tied very tightly to the electrification of an economy and the need for materials and things like this. Was there something that happened? Was there a particular chain of events that happened, or was it something that just evolved over time where all of a sudden, corporate leaders, policy leaders, everyone just looked around and was like, whoa, shit, like this is happening. Like we are now at the point where, we see in the near future electrification, from whatever direction, EV storage, like renewable energy sources, these things are coming, and we need to do something about it. So I guess was it an event or a series of events, or was it something that was bigger picture that created this shift in thinking and this downstream market and industry activity?
Well, I think there's a few things there. Is that the world just got better at producing batteries. And if you look at, I think the latest estimates were something near $100 per kilowatt hour for a battery. You might want to check that and verify. But okay. That's basically a 20-fold drop since 2025, and you've been just on this, straight downward angle in terms of battery costs because, the industry just got smarter in terms of learning effects, economies of scale, and when that happened, people started to come around to the idea that EVs, no matter how far we are on adoption, they're gonna get cheaper. And because EVs at the end of the day are just they're a giant battery, and if that gets cheaper, there's going to be more EV adoption. There's going to need to be more materials supply, and if you're an automotive OEM and you don't have oversight over your supply, you're going to have challenges. I think that was starting a few years ago. Then you look out at the multitude of applications, things like defense, where rare earths play a significant role. So that's why rare earths have been in the spotlight so much. And just the fact that China really owns the dominant majority of refining capacity. Many of the materials, lithium, for example, cobalt, which was
Is there a reason for that?
They've built up the capacity, and that's just that's a matter of national strategy in many cases.
Okay.
In many cases, China was really specialized in the upgrading of raw materials, which tend to be very dirty industries, by the way. That's the import of raw materials, processing, managing waste streams, up to inputs for electrical components.
Was it something that them as a country, or whoever needed to decide, I guess, was it just a matter of, like you said, national strategy? They were just earlier. It was just a bet that ended up working out.
So I guess it kind of varies, or I would put it through two lenses. In some ways, it's absolutely a strategic move. China back into the early aughts was looking at things like electric vehicles, okay, and essentially positing that this would be a great way to break dependence on the outside world for energy. China's heavily dependent on oil imports. So having more electrification of transport was going to be a way to break that dependence, and having capacity to refine minerals was going to be a way to feed that industry. Also, China does have some strategic reserves of rare earths specifically, and you might have to check me on this, but I think I recall there were directives going back to the Mao Zedong days of wanting to develop these reserves into a strategic industry.
Cool.
So, you develop the refining capacity, and that becomes a critical step where they might be extracted in China, but typically outside of China, then refined there. And it was just not an attractive industry in the rest of the world. Again, these industries, the refining is very dirty. It is not especially high margin in many cases. You're producing commodities, and commodities tend to seek the lowest venue of production, the lowest or lowest cost venue of production.
Sure.
So in that way, I think it was overlooked in many cases in the West. It was seen as something that was easily easily outsourced. And as well, the offtake industries were not picking up as fast here.
Okay.
So, I can recall working in a consulting firm in China it was probably 10 years ago, talking to a tier 1 supplier from outside of China who wanted to sell electric drivetrain technology in China, and had essentially said, well, we have the technology. It's just that there's very few electric buses on the road in our home country. So they're putting electric buses on the road in China. This is just where we've got to sell them right now. This is going to be the opportunity for us to generate revenue from this IP. So I think when you have all those factors coalescing, you've got the capacity, you've got the offtake demand owners, these end industries, which first was electrification in China. That buildup of capacity becomes a lot easier to maintain. And it takes years to get these facilities online. So that is where the rest of the world is catching up.
Thank you. Again, just another, very, very curious about that. I have this on Freedom. It's just so cool I get to ask these questions, so I appreciate you answering them. In the theme of electrification, and this seems like the direction we're going. So, I'm still extremely, personally nascent in the space of fission, fusion, that type of energy. I've had some extremely informative episodes recently. People walking through the history of fusion in the U.S., globally, how it works, where it's at now, things like this. There was a quote. You can give your opinion, but there's a quote that where he said the ideal mix of nuclear in the energy supply of a grid is around 10-15% or something like that, because the nature of nuclear is that it's running continuously, and it's not it's not a suitable energy source necessarily for something like a data center potentially that has different capacity needs at different times of the day. And so again, you can give your thoughts on that, and if I'm remembering correctly, that's what he said. But as far as the idea of electrification, without the perspective of people that just love fossil fuels, because that's not an answer, but are there any other perspectives on where we're going? Like, are there any arguments against electrification in any type of way, or is it really the only thing that's ahead of us?
Well, I think the first thing to understand is that electrification of any kind of endpoint, and I'm thinking especially if things are battery based, these come down the cost curve very differently. They come down the cost curve like a power electronic. So think of how expensive an iPhone was in nominal terms 15 years ago. It was probably $1,000. I don't know what it is today. It's probably probably about 500 some odd dollars. So it's come in half in nominal terms. And then you think of when you adjust for inflation, how much $1,000 was worth 15 years ago versus today. So I'm not going to give you a perfect number, but I want to say it's 3-4 times cheaper. That is the cost curve that power electronics come down. There's something called Moore's Law, which some of your guests might have expounded on. And that's essentially the idea that on a chip, every year you can basically add more transistors onto a chip, and you're going to have a very fast increase in the compute efficiency of that chip. The same thing is true in many cases of batteries. So, you're having the electrification of things like transport, energy storage now, and that's happening at data centers too. A lot of lithium-ion batteries going in, and they just keep getting cheaper and cheaper. So in that regard, I don't think there's very strong arguments long-term against electrification. You have some midterm frictions, right? You're always going to hear charging and range anxiety on electric vehicles. It's a real concern if you're traveling distances, but I think the average trip to work for an American is 9 miles. And I think the average daily trip for somebody who's going to work, picking up kids, etc., is something like 40 miles. So how much should we hem and haw over 300 miles per charge versus 350? It's these kinds of things where I think the technology is just outpacing public perception, frankly. And it is going to get cheaper because the batteries are getting cheaper to produce. The learning effects from producing a vehicle, the finished vehicle, are going to get better, continually getting better. So in terms of, you have a lot of today arguments against electrification. And I'm thinking of vehicles specifically. A today argument being, well, it's more expensive than an internal combustion vehicle, which is not always true, actually. And then the other argument might be something like the infrastructure is not ready. That obviously is changing as well, because again, vehicles are going to get more efficient, batteries get more power dense, and I think there's going to be more people coming around the things like at-home charging, and chargers will get deployed a little bit more. So those frictions get reduced every year. I think we are on a path to cheaper, more easily operated electric vehicles, and you're going to have more adoption as a result. Now, what that does is that's going to create a totally new challenge of needing to supply more electricity versus just fuels, or not just fuels, but shifting fuels to electricity. And that's where you're going to have the challenge of baseload power. You're going to need consistent power into the grid, and that's where things beyond wind and solar become really valuable. You're seeing that at data centers going and forward positioning themselves to someday take in electricity from nuclear fission, someday fusion. You have power purchase agreements happening around that. Another one I'd point to here in the US, which frankly feels like an industry we have a good shot at being a winner in, is enhanced geothermal. This is the idea that you're essentially using heat from the ground to boil water, spin a turbine, generate electricity. And you've got some companies with real traction there. Back 6 years ago at CleanTech Group, we said this is great for the 2030s, but now you've got companies in operation supplying power commercially with enhanced geothermal. They're getting power purchase agreements. You just saw Fervo Energy file for an IPO about a week and a half ago. There's real traction there. So I would say that a direct answer to your question, there are immediate term arguments against electrification, but I think those get weaker and weaker every year.
Noted. Cool. So make space in my household for storage batteries. Is that what you're saying?
In many cases, that's practical.
Okay. I wonder if you get, I don't know, how big do these batteries need to be? Like, can you make it like a couch or something? Is that even safe? You know what I mean?
In theory, you could. Yeah.
All right. I'll keep that in the back of my head. I'll get back to you on that. So, quick sprint about this concept that you guys have, which is, if I'm not butchering it, slow, flow, grow. As far as understanding where different companies, I believe, are, as far as the pace at which they'll grow. Can you explain that framework?
Yeah, so I'm going to explain it in reverse just because that's my muscle memory.
Do it.
We have this grow, flow, slow framework, and essentially, your viewers, if they go download our Global CleanTech 100, you'll see that in kind of a bullseye chart. The outer ring being grow, which are things we expect to accelerate in the coming year. And accelerate, I'm talking a holistic acceleration, more adoption, more deployment, more investment ideally, but just generally a forward progress. The flow ring in the middle are things we think will generally progress at the current pace. Might be lateral, it might be in kind of incremental growth, just the trajectory they're on now, maybe with a little bit of nuance. That middle piece is slow. Things we think will face headwinds. We'll see a drop-off in deployment, potentially a drop-off in investments, and become generally less attractive over the next year to innovators. As I've characterized it for 2026, what we expect is a quote-unquote pressure cooking effect. What I mean by that is I just kind of envision that bullseye as being in the center of a pressure cooker that gets tighter through the year. If you're looking at that grow ring, you're going to see a lot of technologies in basically two thematics. The first thematic being the race to own AI infrastructure. which is now very quickly overlapping with an argument for national security, national sovereignty. Everything in that value chain is getting pulled through into the market faster now. That's things like fission, fusion, geothermal. They can all supply clean baseload power to a data center. That is things like a new industry that's been spurred around speed to power, which is modular stand-up of power, or bringing power to the site. Companies like Crusoe Energy, Exawatt, companies have gotten a lot of press over the past few years for doing that. There's a big pull-through effect on chips and semiconductors that are angling for energy efficiency. So I'm thinking things like photonics chips for inference. As more inference as more compute becomes inference and more inference moves to the edge. You've got everything happening in a data center. That's going to be things like cooling. That's going to be things like waste heat to power. And then you've also got power electronics, things that can be applicable in the grid or in a data center, transformers, high temperature superconductors, all getting pulled into the market. So that's thematic number one. You see a lot of those in the grow ring. Thematic number two is going to be that emerging nexus between clean tech and national security and defense. You see that very well reflected in the amount of critical minerals technologies that we have in that grow ring. And forgive me if I miss one, but certainly rare earths, lithium, copper are in there, as well as things like AI for mining. You've also got some other things that might be more dual use, not just military supply chain. I'm thinking things like Earth observation. A lot of Earth observation technologies have had the environmental application for years. Think of things like methane sensing. If you can sense methane leaks from a satellite, you can probably sense troop movements too. So those have long had that crossover, but now are getting a faster pull-through effect. The challenge there, Blake, is when you've got two thematics and you've got demand signals coming from a few places, there's going to be much more competition. Everyone wants to get into these spaces now. Every day, I read a press release about a new company that was born to do AI optimization. Maybe that is in some type of component. A lot happening now in software to manage AI data centers, the grids around them. I think twice this week I've read about a seed round of a company that just came out of stealth. A lot of new companies going in. And then also in this defense / critical minerals nexus, companies pivoting in there too. Companies that might have had in extraction or mining tailings treatment technology, maybe a battery recycling technology, that they were angling at something else, but now they're angling for things like rare earths. They just have a process that can select for specific minerals, and now, whereas they were going after maybe steel refining before, now they're going into critical minerals. So you've certainly got new entrants coming into that space, and you've got a lot of folks pivoting in. So that outer grow ring is just getting more intense. That's kind of pressure cooking effect number one. What that outer grow ring has been largely insulated against is things like high inflation, is things like the geopolitics and the tariffs, because these things just have such strong demand pull that they're just growing consistently. But in those center rings, the flow and the slow, I actually think a lot of those folks are feeling the geopolitics, the politics, national politics in the US, and still the high inflation, feeling that more acutely. So some of those areas that might be more capital intensive have maybe predicated some of their long-term plans on having more tax credits, on potentially input costs being a certain price, now are just seeing more fluctuation. Some of these things were dropping off prior to 2025, but I think our general hypothesis is if you're looking at a lot of the things in the flow and slow rings, this is going to be a hard year for those technologies to break out and see a faster than current pace growth.
So when you're placing when you're deciding what to put in what ring, a lot of what you, and I'm going to compress the end here, so we'll get through the next couple of questions, but when we're talking about what to place in which rings, a lot of what you talked about was things that are happening around in the market and external factors. How important is it what's happening internally at a company to you guys? I mean, we could talk about, and again, I don't know how feasible it is for this to be in a research report, but the things I think about are like hiring. I mean, one thing you did talk about was how capital intensive a certain business model is. So just external versus internal factors, things like that.
I might start by framing it as we don't use the growth flow slow to categorize companies. However, it is the analysis of companies that bottom up that ultimately informs that. Something we do for our clients, for the members to our market intelligence service, is we actually go and score companies. We'll do a breakdown of a given company, and we will actually assign them a score on a 0 to 3 basis on innovation, on cost competitiveness, potential to scale, ability to scale, and then impact, which we're defining as a combination of resource efficiency and resilience.
Cool.
So that's something that we don't publish. We keep that for our members. And of course, the companies we evaluate are aware of it. But it's the culmination of a lot of those exercises that gets us to the grow, flow, slow. And it's a qualitative measure of how confident we are in the trajectory of these things. It's partially informed by the investment momentum over the past year.
Okay.
It's very much so informed by some of the demand signals. Are some of these things too early to see things like a power purchase agreement or an offtake agreement? Are some of these things at the right maturity stage, but just not seeing it? And then you, of course, are going to look also at things like exits. So we saw a ton of mergers and acquisitions in the past year or so, a ton relatively speaking, in cooling technologies for data centers. So that's just showing a clear demand pull. That's a corporate going and acquiring a company. You also see things like IPOs and IPO filings in fission and in geothermal. So we expect a little bit more there. Energy efficient chips also seeing significant commercial traction. Just saw a huge licensing deal between NVIDIA and a company Grok, $20 billion, and then also a few recent acquisitions. So we're indexing on the momentum, but then also the things we're hearing from conversations with people. Again, it's that human intelligence piece that informs that grow, flow, slow. So it is a combination of the quantitative up to that point, but the quantitative only tells you what's happened up until today. The qualitative really helps you look forward.
Cool. So on the back of that, I have 3 final questions for the episode. The first one is, and I'd love to do this per theme, per industry, per whatever category would make sense for you. High level for someone that's building something, for someone that's thinking about it, or 4 years deep into building their company. What advice would you give as far as what gets a company from 0 to 1 or 1 to 2?
This year or in general?
Cool.
Or is there a difference?
Wherever you want to take it.
Yeah. I think you got to you have to be aware of how much is probably working against you in the macro economy. And that's going to be things like uncertain trade environments, which is going to mean uncertainty on your input costs. There is still high inflation in many cases. So if you're launching, you're getting into into a commercial phase, or really wherever you're at, I do think that just going extremely lean on your costs is very important. And we've actually seen a bit of a trend in innovators over the past year where many of them are foregoing the perhaps expensive first-of-a-kind projects or the big, more flashy pilot projects with a corporate to basically say, I'm going to contract manufacture, I'm going to outsource a little bit. I might sacrifice a little bit of the utilization of my core IP or the maximization of that to get some parts off the shelf versus building out a unique process because it's revenue today. And maybe I'm not taking as flashy of a swing at this, but I'm going to build revenue a little bit faster just so I can get through this next year or so, keeping investors on board, more slowly acquiring customers. That is something that we're certainly hearing. And we're also hearing a totally different mentality on the other end of the spectrum from people producing things like batteries and things like chemicals, which is, all right, corporates are really in a bit of a wait and see mode. Maybe you've got to circumvent them altogether to not have this high cash burn for the next year of waiting for a partnership to take hold or waiting for a partnership to turn commercial. And how that's manifesting is I talked to a few investors last week at our forum who said, we're willing to put more money in to see somebody go and just do the whole thing versus them going and producing a component or an OEM piece of equipment. We do think there's going to be a faster path to revenue by just spending more and doing the whole thing. But there's no reason these two ideas can't come together, right? You can go and you maybe have a great lithium refining technology, but your backers say it's going to take too long for the refiners to adopt your technology. Go and just produce lithium and sell that. You're going to get more money to do that. And you can probably take some things off the shelf. You can probably do a few contract manufacturing things to make your process fill out. So I think people are, on one hand, going a lot leaner in the decisions they make to getting to commercial traction. And in other spaces, people are trying to compress time to commercial traction. So there's, you can mix and match these approaches. And then in some spaces, people are just going all the way in one direction or another. But I think the assumptions that were present a few years ago that, high cost automatically equals high output. And, your cost is going to have some linear relationship to your eventual revenue. I think that's really melted away and people are becoming very practical. Last week at our forum in California, I heard all kinds of very practical cost reduction arguments from innovators.
Cool. Cool. So I would say we've talked a lot. The whole episode has been about where the industry's at, how everyone else is building, what your guys' views are. Anthony, I'm curious for you, and this is my second question out of the three. What is the biggest hurdle that you're facing at the moment at CleanTech Group, and how is it also an opportunity?
I'd say the biggest hurdle is it's getting people to see beyond. Let me rephrase it. It's getting people to go 2 steps ahead in their thinking and understand where the opportunities are going to be based on decisions today. I'll give a few examples. When we're talking to folks who are really interested in this data center space, you still have some people kind of on the fence saying, should I get in? Should I not? Is this a bubble? Is it not? I think if you're not already getting into the space as a supplier, as a corporate acquirer, you're likely missing the boat. You don't have 2 years to let it develop. I think it'll still be hugely lucrative in 2 years because even if the current AI models shift or something changes, look, a lot of this is an infrastructure play and you're going to get yourself in and be owning some of the infrastructure earlier than some of the demand. I'll give a totally different example, is a thematic that we really kind of always try to hammer home is that of adaptation and resilience. That's adaptation to climate change effects, and then that makes you more resilient to them, right? And this manifests across a few technologies. It can be wildfire detection and wildfire intervention. It can be things like flood resilience. It can be things like grid hardening, and then also it can be things like parametric insurance. Anybody talks to me about this knows, has probably endured my lecture that this is serially underengaged, criminally underengaged. And if you believe a few things, if you believe that extreme weather is going to continue compounding, that there's going to be more damage, and if you believe that most people are behind the curve, which I think most of the data will tell you that's the case, you've got to believe that there's a huge opportunity for these technologies. I do think that this is an area where we find ourselves not just members to our research service, but also the general public when we're out giving presentations. I frankly feel like we're shaking people by the shoulders a little bit and saying, this is going to be it. We're going beyond the 1.5 warming world, and the weather events you see this year are just going to repeat themselves every year. So there's good technology out there, and there's folks who are going to ultimately launch very successful businesses by being ahead of the curve. This is where we constantly encourage corporate adopters to start engaging those.
I'm glad you made the distinction between adaptation and resilience. I just read a post today. Are you familiar with Louis Woodall at Climate Proof?
I don't think we know each other, no.
Anyway, well, he's cool and he puts out great work, and his publication is all about climate adaptation. And he just had a post today where he responded to a Bloomberg reporter that made resilience and adaptation seem like the same thing. And I just wanted to say, I appreciate that you made the distinction, because resilience is the outcome of adaptation. Technologies. And I think that's awesome. So that is, definitely a huge hurdle. And hopefully a good opportunity. So finally, at the end of this incredible, wonderful episode, I'm so grateful for your time. I'm curious, what inspires you?
Well, I think this is a space where you see gradual and then all at once progress, right? I think in some of these areas, like I gave the example like geothermal, we talked to members to our research service for years about this, and it felt very gradual, and now it's all at once. So it's a space that frankly rewards patience, but it requires a lot of patience. It doesn't have those constant, maybe big headline things that things like enterprise software might have or social media. You do have these long, really kind of grinding periods where things are incrementally progressing. And as an analyst, you still got to keep pace of them, try to understand where there's signals. And then you start to see very fast progress, like some of the things you've seen in recent years on clean baseload, on critical minerals. So that's always very rewarding. And I think that generally speaking, it's a down-to-earth community. When I think of things like our CleanTech forums, there's no VIP section. The speakers aren't in a green room. Everybody's mingling with everybody. And frankly, a lot of good collisions happen. But, I hear that every year when we come back from our forums is I met an investor there, or a corporate says, I actually found the solution I was looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And some of that is collisions we facilitate at CleanTech Group. Otherwise, it's a lot of just, a benefit people get from being part of our community. So that's very rewarding. And it's something where, again, the accumulation of those experiences allows me to look back at my time here and really see material progress in a lot of these spaces.
That's awesome. That is super cool and inspiring to me. I also shout out for, I think it was unintentional, but the punny said down to earth, rare materials, hilarious. So a lot of good collisions, fusion, fission. I forget which one it is, but that's also good. Which one is it, by the way? Which one? That's fission, right?
Yeah.
Fusion.
Fusion is combining. Yeah.
All right, good. So yeah, it was a fusion fun. Well done.
That was anyone else unintended, totally unintended.
There you go. Look, it's just in you, Anthony. You just got it. What if anyone else was inspired, to follow along or get in touch outside of downloading your report, because I highly recommend. I've read it a bunch of times. Very insightful, and there's like 50% of my questions unasked, so it's very, very informative. What's the best way to get in touch?
Yeah, feel free to follow us on LinkedIn. Also, feel free to reach out anytime to research@cleantech.com. And I would highly encourage anybody listening to this to listen to the, I believe, Blake, 5 follow-on episodes with our analyst team, where you're going to hear much smarter insights and you're going to get down into the nitty-gritty of a lot of these spaces.
That's right. Good plug. I like that. Yeah, I'm more excited than anybody for it. So, but Anthony, thank you so much for your time. This was incredible. I'm excited for the next one. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.